Let's just go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us today. We're here today to do two things. Mostly we're going to talk about some ways you can work with contemporary art in your classroom using resources from SchoolArts magazine that are free. And also we're just going to talk a lot about artists that we're excited about, that we've had the great luck and opportunity to work with as part of our job at SchoolArts. So you can see a couple of covers that feature different artists we've worked with and an image of artist Lauren Clay on this head slide here. And now we're gonna introduce ourselves. So Karl.
I'm Karl Cole. I'm the art historian and curator of images for Davis Publications. And Rob and I co-write the Looking and Learning article for SchoolArts magazine.
That's right. So I'm Rob Sandagata. That's me and my two dogs right there. This is what we've been doing recently. And as part of my main role is I'm the director of digital curriculum for Davis, and I oversee Davis Digital. But I was a high school art teacher for 5 years before I joined Davis. So I work in a lot of editorial capacities. One of them is writing, looking, and learning with Karl, which is one of my favorite things to do. And I also recently edited the Open Art Room, which was written by Melissa Pertee and Ian Sands. So before we get started, I wanted to kick it off with something that probably maybe not everyone will agree with, but I believe that GIFs and memes are an art form because they don't really fit well into other categories. They're not exactly entertainment. I mean, they are, but they're a little too weird. And some of them obviously are not very artistic, but I feel like these two that I chose kind of fall into that category where it is an art form. It's well designed. It's funny, but there's a lot of intentional thought that goes behind it. Some of them are incredibly clever and very meaningful, but it's this very different and kind of new way of communicating. So when we're thinking about contemporary art, we also have to think about art coming from places that maybe we haven't always considered. And I think this is one of those. So I really love this skeleton that apparently is so bored with his quarantine that he's just throwing cheese balls onto the floor to be picked up by the Roomba, which is pretty great. There's also, if you go onto Giphy.com and just look for the animated stuff, there's a lot of artists who are pretty much working exclusively by making GIFs and promoting their work this way, which is really interesting. Okay. This is another, for me, this is a big moment from this year. This was part of the Grammy Awards, I think. Yeah. This moment, of course, is from a Lil Nas X live performance, but this to me is the aesthetic of a lot of contemporary art. So you're having this merging of kind of outrageous personas and characters and bright colors and pop art. And it's becoming more and more a part of a cultural aesthetic that is recognized by wider audiences. And if you kind of look at some images of some of the most well-known pop performers of recent years, including like Kanye West and Katy Perry and people like that, like they're hiring artists, contemporary artists, to design their backdrops or design, design their stage, their costumes and that sort of thing. So, this is maybe not really that different from something that Nick Cave is doing or other performance artists that use sound in music. So another thing we wanted to start out by showing you was both of our artworks. So this is one of Karl's paintings. Karl, do you want to say anything about this?
Well, it's not a terribly good image. It's from my phone, so it's a lot richer color than that.
Would you like to say anything about your practice?
Oh, I paint landscapes. That's my weekend pleasure.
And how long have you been painting in this style?
Oh, geez. About 20, 23 years.
Yeah. So this is Carl's painting. I'm also going to mention that Carl also draws a comic book it's a collaboration with a friend of his that he's been working on for how many years?
Oh, God, over 30 years.
Over 30 years of a collaboration, which is pretty awesome. Um, okay, and here's one of my paintings. So in showing these two paintings, we wanted to kind of start things off by showing our connection through our personal artwork as well as our love for contemporary art, but also to show how different the artwork that we make is. Like Karl and I's paintings are very different. I would say probably the most common thing is like an intentional use of color, but you know, there's two very different worlds at work here. But Karl and I are united in our love for contemporary art, our excitement for contemporary art. We don't always love all of the same stuff, and we don't have to, because contemporary art is vast and endless, and there's no way that you can or should like all contemporary art. It caters to different tastes, different styles, different ways of making art. So when we are going about selecting artists to be featured in Looking and Learning, we try as hard as possible to feature a continually and intentionally diverse group of artists, not only in terms of their cultural diversity, but global diversity, as well as just the diversity of media, diversity of style. So sometimes we'll include contemporary artists that are maybe working more on the craft side. We'll do media artists, we'll do digital artists, we'll use a lot of diverse artists. But if you're not familiar with what Looking and Learning is, this is a monthly center article that's in SchoolArts magazine. So it's the center section. There's usually a pull-out centerfold on one side, and our writing is on the other side. Karl and I have been collaborating on Looking and Learning, I think, for about 7 years now.
Yeah.
Which is mind-boggling. I can't believe it's been 7 years already.
Well, I will say that within the last year, we have covered so many different artists, including video game artists, artists who work in emojis. I think we've reached the point with Looking and Learning where anything is fair game. Anything that we think is interesting contemporary art that's done aesthetically well and not just for goofing off. I think we're open to anything.
Yes.
And we've seen some amazing, amazing stuff that probably 10 years ago would not have been featured in an art history book or an art one curriculum.
Absolutely. And so part of that, you know, we decided probably about 7 years ago, we wanted to always be focused on contemporary artists. For a while, we were featuring a contemporary artist and a historical artist, or a more well-known artist that were related in some way, usually by theme. And but the past 3 years, we've caught on to this new focus where there's a writing by Karl that kind of talks about their work, analyzes their work and the themes in their work, a little bit of biographical information, connects that artist to trends in art history, which is really important. Because it's, you know, you don't have to know everything about art history, but you should know in general how contemporary artists do connect to that art history.
Can I just tell a quick funny story about
Sure.
the painter Pat Adams? She was one of the pioneers of the feminist art movement in the 70s. And I met her at College Art Association, and she asked me point blank, "Do you paint?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I never trust an art historian who's not an artist." And there is something to that. I happen to feel that it's a big help that I'm an artist as well as an art historian, because some art historians can be very dry.
Well, and that's certainly something that we are concerned about, is making sure that our writing is approachable, not overly academic, and while still having good content. So we start with this contextual historical write-up. Then we have a short interview with each of the artists, which is really awesome. And then we have some short prompts for studio experiences. And these are meant to be as open-ended as possible and can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And I wrote those. The interviews are really interesting. When we were first putting this approach together, we asked a few teachers that we know to work with their students to give us some questions. So here's the center spread of the magazine. This is an artist named Lauren Clay, who is actually in the current April issue. And we were really excited about her work, which is combining so many different elements. You've got media, you've got marbling of paper, which is, you know, often considered a crafty sort of thing. And you have sculptural elements, and it's on a massive scale.
And she does digital printouts of her drawings to blow them up to monumental scale, which is so awesome.
Yeah. And, you know, it's an installation. So this is a really exciting thing about some of the artists that we choose. We've been trying intentionally not just to focus on artists that people already know. I mean, one reason for that is those artists tend to be a little bit harder to work with. But also, we want to emphasize the idea that there are, you know, there's not a limitless number of artists, but there are huge numbers of artists that are working in different parts of the country. There's artists probably in your community. Even if you're in a rural place, there's at least one or two artists kicking around that are doing some interesting things. We want to focus on artists that are emerging, artists that are still getting started, because we want to emphasize the approachability and accessibility of some of these artists. So here's a quick look at our artist Q&A. And you'll see we get some really cool questions. So we have some typical questions that you might expect. What are some of the biggest influences on your work? One of my favorite questions is, what is a typical work day like for you? Because depending on where these artists are in their careers and what they do, they have very different answers. You know, some of them have a day job teaching. Some of them are working with assistants. It's really, really interesting to see what kind of answers we get. And we also get unique responses that are in the artist's voice. So this isn't, you know, Karl or I reinterpreting what the artist's work is about or what they have to say. This is directly from them. So one of the things I wanted to mention with this kind of quarantine time, we're trying to figure out how to do some remote learning. These interviews are totally accessible to your students. So you could have them read the artist's Q&A and think about additional questions that they might ask the artist, or read the artist Q&As and come up with, you know, pick 3 artists, read the interviews. What are 3 things they had in common? What were 3 differences? What do you share with those artists? And those could be a jumping off point for you. The studio experiences, you'll see these are really prompts, and they range from being really simple to really complex. So some of these might work well for the remote learning as well. Develop a 2-dimensional artwork that creates an illusion of 3-dimensional space. Very open-ended and simple, but design a digital or small-scale model for a room-sized art installation. But also, we always try to find one that also kind of lines up with the artist's content. So these are just some of the resources. Oops.
Hey, Rob.
Yep.
How can, oh, you're getting there right now.
Yes.
How can the students access all of this great content?
So if you go to schoolartsmagazine.com, which looks like this, you will find beneath this, you'll find the most recent issue. So this is the May 2020 issue. So you can have students go directly in and go to the looking and learning link right here. Here, I'll use the pointer. Or you can click on all issues, which will take you to the library that goes back to 2018. So every issue we've done since 2018 is available online for free. You can go to Looking and Learning, and you can also, once you have the issue open, you can share that link with the students as well. So you could take that and put that in your Google Classroom or Seesaw or whatever current system you're using for online learning. Okay, we haven't mentioned this yet. It looks like some of you are already doing it, but if you have questions for Karl or me, please type them into the chat box, and then when we take breaks, Tony will start feeding them to us. But if you don't have a lot of questions, you just want to sit back and learn about some more artists, we're here for that as well. So, okay, I've been talking for a long time, so I think Karl should tell us a little bit about our first artist.
Oh, this woman is wonderful. There's actually one of her murals is on the wall of the building next to our office in Worcester. And that was when I first learned about her. And then I thought she would be a great.
Uh-oh. Well, it looks like Karl's paused for a second, so I'll jump back in. Yeah, so Sneha Shrestha, she also goes by the name Imagine 876. She is a street artist, graffiti artist, but one of the unique things about her work is that she is using Sanskrit letters for her work. And you can see that these larger letters are all made up of much smaller letter forms. They're incredibly beautiful and graceful. So some basic information about her. She's originally from Nepal, and she attended college in the Boston area. And when she was there, she got really excited about graffiti and street art, and was able to get involved with some programs where she learned from a few Boston street artists. So she had a mentor who taught her everything about street art. So she's done some really large scale pieces in the city of Boston, but also in places throughout the world. As I mentioned before, you can kind of see the Sanskrit lettering in her designs. This is a massive piece that she did. But she also incorporates meaningful quotes from poets, philosophers, Buddhists, Taoists, and she incorporates those into these pieces. So hidden within this mass of beautiful lettering is a distinct message. And she does that in almost all of her pieces. Another really exciting thing about her is that she founded the Children's Art Museum of Nepal, which is in Kathmandu, Nepal, which is where she grew up, I believe, in 2014. So in addition to her work as a street artist, she works in a community art education, can't remember exactly what program, through Harvard University. And she also founded her own children's museum in Nepal. It was the first museum of its kind in that country, which is really exciting. So let's see, here's a few more pieces of hers. But there's so many great things that you can talk about with her work. You've got the hidden message in the work, you've got the inspirational quote that's in it, but also so many amazing formal qualities that you can talk about. So if you want to go get into your typical elements and principles or that sort of thing, they're obviously there. You know, you've got some radial balance here. But just to look at the technique of how she does some of the lettering, you can see some of the lettering is done with large brushes or rollers. But it's pretty amazing stuff. And of course, she also does some gallery work that's a little bit smaller scale. So I thought I would include that as well. So here's a triptych that she has done. But essentially, it's the same thing she's doing in her mural pieces, but at a much smaller scale. Okay. Hopefully Karl will be able to rejoin. We know he's been having some internet problems, and I think we're facing some thunderstorms or bad weather up here today, so that could be impacting him, but hopefully he'll be back in a minute, because it's a lot more fun when it's with me and Karl, not just me. So our next artist that we're spotlighting today, his name is Daniel Minter. So here's a photo of him with his artwork behind him, and the broom is included because that is a symbol that he uses in a lot of his work. So Daniel Minter is another artist I didn't know about until I encountered his work at the Portland Museum a couple of summers back. I was there for a visit, and he had this just incredible installation called A Distant Holla, and this is just part of that piece. So first of all, you have a combination of many different elements. You've got sculptural elements, you've got carved wood, you have found objects, you have a couple of different styles of painting, and all coming from the same artist. You can't see in this picture, but higher up on the wall, there's another piece with small figures hanging on it. And so there's a lot of depth to his work. His work references a lot of the African-American experience, also the journey of the Underground Railroad and the history of slavery in the United States. He was born in Georgia, so he grew up in the Deep South, and eventually his work as an artist led him to Maine, and he's a professor of art in Maine. Some of the symbols he uses are from Africa, the African Caribbean, or used in African American art. So you'll see like the cotton, the broom, the ochre that you see in this painting right here. Those are reused frequently in his work. And I kind of mentioned this already, but African diaspora, everyday African American life, childhood in the South. There's also a story chronicled in his artwork. You'll see it in this piece. There's a lot of pieces that are referencing water. Of course, that could be the cross-continental travel, but also there's an island in Maine called Malaga Island, which most people have never heard of. I certainly never had. Growing up in New England, it's not something that we were taught in history class, but Malaga Island was settled by an all African ex-slaves. Well, most of them were, yeah. And they settled on a small island in Maine. It became their island. It was a successful fishing island, and they lived there probably for 50 years, maybe, at least until 1912. And at that time, the government of Maine became threatened by their existence for reasons of institutional racism, and basically removed them from the island and took it away from them. So Daniel Minter has done a lot of work exploring this story that is virtually unknown to many Americans. That is an unfortunate part of our history. But the work is just really beautiful, and you can really feel the sense of loss or longing just emanating from these pieces, and it's even stronger when you see them in person. So we just thought, I showed it to Karl. Karl was very excited as well. That just, here's a really incredible artist who's making this really powerful and meaningful work, who, for whatever reason, is flying underneath the radar. So we decided to feature him in SchoolArts, and he was very excited about it. An interesting fact, another side job that Daniel Minter has is he also works he does illustrations for children's books. Okay, so this is the third artist. It's really too bad Carl's not here. Carl picked which artists we were going to feature today, so I know he probably had some things prepared that he wanted to say about each one of them. This next artist is Jennifer Vinegar Avery, who is, you can tell by this photo that Jennifer is just a real a force. She's quite a personality. But her work is very contemporary and very non-traditional. You know, she challenges a lot of things. She's got a background in punk rock music, and but Jennifer combines so many different elements in her work. So you've got textile art, performance, sculpture, installation art. There's definitely a theatrical aspect to the work, as well as painting and digital design. So this image on the right is a walk-in installation that she created. But there's also some really interesting things about it. So this, I should have written it down, but there's a story about a philosopher who, this is real history. He was an alchemist and a philosopher, and he had his nose cut off in a duel. So he had a false golden nose that he would wear that was like really, and he would have parties in his mansion, and he had a pet elk. And so this is the elk, and at one of the parties, the elk drank a lot of the wine that was available and then fell down the stairs. And so this story that Jennifer Vinegar Avery came across became like the inspiration for this piece. So not only are these kind of bizarre Victorian sculptural figures, there's strange masks everywhere. And you've got these two costumes that she and her husband were wearing during the opening. So one of them was the elk, and the other one was the philosopher with the golden nose. Her work also has gotten some great recognition. She took a show she did called Beast Boutique, which is like a insane thrift store, but also performance art. And that was brought to through the Hermé Foundation. She was the first American to win this honor of being brought to Paris for an installation and residency. And then a year or two later, she also repeated that in Tokyo. So it's pretty amazing. There's also a lot of content about gender and fairy tales, as well as those historical references. But another reason we thought that she'd be good to include, given the quarantine situation that everyone's dealing with, is clearly the name of the game for Jennifer is non-traditional art materials. And you can see a lot of what she uses is made out of fabric, plastic, things found around the house. So this is a performance piece she did that is like a tea party in the woods with multiple performers and all kinds of sculptural elements. These are potentially things that students can do in their yards or in the street outside their house, depending on where they live. But that could be an interesting take, or also just, I think, inspiring for students in terms of like there really being an absolute freedom. And when you meet an artist like Jennifer, that's something that really comes through, is just this absolute freedom to create and ability to make things out of nothing, and to just it's just really a living kind of artwork that's really exciting. Okay, so those were the three artists we first wanted to feature. So I'll pause and see if there's any questions for us.
There aren't any questions yet. People must just love the wonderful artwork that you're sharing. I say move on to the next artists in your list.
Okay, great. Sounds good.
Hold on. Actually, we did have one question. Are all of these authors featured in SchoolArts?
Yes, yes. So all the artists we're showing you today have been featured in SchoolArts. And I think the majority have been featured since 2018. So most of them should be up on that website. There might be one or two as we get further back that are not there yet. But okay, this one I really wanted Karl to talk about because I'm gonna not pronounce her name correctly. So she's a French-Canadian artist, and I'm gonna say Yannick Delorier, but that's probably not correct. And I'm sure Karl would yell at me, but he's not here to do that. So please excuse me if you speak French and know the better way to pronounce this. But so she makes massive sculptures using an incredibly light mesh material. So this is a life-size replica of a destroyed car, but it's made entirely out of mesh, like thin nylon mesh and other kinds of mesh, with a little bit of color added in here and there. But in terms of the ability to, make form and detail, it's really an incredible technical accomplishment. Content-wise, here's a detail shot of that same piece, so you can really see the mesh. So these are coils of mesh, and so you have some black mesh and some gray, some different fabric under here. But she's very interested in the idea of dystopia and decay, urban decay, as well as I think of kind of a cultural decay. Oh, and it looks like Karl's on his way back in, which is awesome. So yeah, just really, really exciting work. Let's see.
I'm back.
Hey, Karl, will you pronounce her name correctly for everyone?
Delorier.
What about the first name?
Yannick.
Yannick Delorier. Okay, I wasn't that bad. All right.
No, you were fine, dude.
Okay.
Host,
Okay.
could you enable my camera again?
Yeah, give me one second.
I'm sorry about that. I keep losing the internet.
Well, we're glad you're back, Karl.
I got cut off in the middle of Sneha, who I just think is so wonderful. The way she combines Sanskrit with graffiti writing is just so awesome. She actually started doing graffiti in this little alley across the street from Artists and Craftsman Shop in Boston, in Cambridge, where I get my stretcher bars and canvas. And you can see different artists practice there. And she said when she was first practicing graffiti, if she went to get a bowl of soup or something and she came back 15 minutes later, somebody would have painted over what she had already started on the wall. So it's a dog-eat-dog world out there in street art.
Karl, I made you co-host again. Do you want Rob to navigate back to the first set of slides so you can speak more about her?
Oh, that's fine. He does a good job. I was on the phone with it actually, but I was only as an attendee. I couldn't talk or anything, so.
Oh.
He's doing a good job.
Yes, he is.
Okay.
Oh, did you tell him that she got her ideas for this blasted car by looking at multiple photos of car bomb victims in Iraq and Afghanistan?
No, I did not mention that.
She looked at multiple angles of photographs of cars that had been destroyed by roadside bombs. And so that's sort of, it's a cautionary tale about war in, the 21st century. And she, the reason she started using translucent materials was because she figured out she could sew aluminum mesh together with regular strong cotton thread, which it's sort of like a three-dimensional drawing.
Yeah, you can even see the threads in this.
Contours around the mesh.
Yeah, and I love how you can see the thread just hanging loose as well. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, well, let's jump to the next one since I just gave it away. Okay, so the next artist, I think he may no longer be online. I think this might have been 2017. But this is an artist I'm really excited about. His name is Young Jake. He kind of has this rapper persona. And he's gotten somewhat well known for doing these emoji portraits of celebrities online. And so he's got a lot of attention for that, but he also has a kind of ironic slash parody hip hop videos that he does. Although those probably you don't want to share with your students. They're not typically safe for K-12, but his Emoji Ink is a really cool project. This is a self-portrait of him on the right. But the way he's able to achieve just detail and color and personality just through the use of emojis is really interesting.
And the thing about his work is that all the emojis he uses to build his forms have something to do with the personality of the person he's portraying.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So like, is this a lot of corn in Taylor Swift here? But you can kind of see in this GIF some of the emojis that he uses in the layers to like build up the portrait. Here's two more. If you go to this website up here, which is Emoji Ink, you can actually, or your students can go to that website and start building a portrait. So it's the same software that he uses to build these portraits.
Can I just say how much these portraits reminded me when we first saw this artist? These portraits reminded me of that Italian Mannerist painter, Arcimboldo, who built portraits of people out of fruits and vegetables and other stuff.
Absolutely.
Amazingly complex.
And you know, that's a great connection too. Maybe you start out showing them Arcimboldo and then you show them what Young Jake is doing. But I mean, this seems like an obvious engaging project to work on with students.
I think Young Jakes are a lot more attractive. Some of Arcimboldo's are sort of creepy. You know, the ones where they have wheat sheaths for a beard or the pumpkin head or whatever.
That's why I love them, Carl. But yes, I think the one thing you should keep in mind is that it's actually very hard to make the portrait look good using and selecting and layering the emojis. Like, it's probably a lot harder than you might initially think. I've attempted multiple times using the Emoji Ink website, and I've never brought something to a finishing point. I always give up. And also, this is a portrait of Kobe Bryant. Now, he did this a few years ago before Kobe died, but I think that would definitely be meaningful with students. And of course, this is The Weeknd, who doesn't have this wonderful hair anymore, which is so sad. These are also two pieces of Young Jake's. So in addition to this very pop-oriented work that he's doing online, he's also doing some very kind of sophisticated, confusing contemporary art that is then being sold in galleries. So for some reason, they involve the angular Fiji water bottle stretched into unusual shapes that sort of look like letters, but all of them involve some kind of water bottle, and they are painted and printed on metal. It's very interesting stuff, but it's a good example of an artist who's working in a lot of different areas, which is also a very contemporary thing.
It's also a very similar aesthetic to the emoji portraits because it's distorted imagery that forms the work of art. Just like the emojis are stretched out and lapped over each other, these bottles are all distorted.
Mm-hmm.
They could easily be part of a portrait as an emoji.
And probably definitely some Basquiat references in the handwritten stuff, the crossouts. But yeah, so that's another artist we really like. Karl, you want to talk about Veronica?
Oh, she's wonderful. The one thing that we wanted to do Veronica Fish was because I think in previous decades, comic books have been sort of sexist and stereotyped figures, and Veronica Fish has brought really a wonderful, elegant style to her illustration and comic work that shows how important women artists are now in the comic industry and in illustration. And she's just a nice person as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that her new version of Archie comics and her graphic novels are just gorgeous. Very gothic.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's at once her style is very classic. There's almost like a 1950s cartooning style illustration element to it, but it's also very modern at the same time.
But it's very contemporary.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you know Archie comics were rebooted, and now Riverdale is a popular TV show. There's all these spin-offs. Veronica's also, she's currently drawing the new adventures of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which is another offshoot of the Archie stuff. And this is one of her personal works. It's Agent Dale Cooper from Twin Peaks reference. But yeah, she's just an amazing comic book artist, and obviously her work in terms of line, color, figure drawing is amazing. But what you see is it's a very feminine aesthetic that is also 100% a graphic novel comic book aesthetic. So it's
she did go to art. She did go to school for graphic design, and she worked as a graphic designer while she said that she was honing her drawing and painting skills. And obviously, she did a really good job because her stuff is just amazing. I love her. So these are like sort of like movie posters. This one from Twin Peaks. I could totally see her doing movie posters.
Yeah, this is really awesome artist. Okay. Oh, you have to talk about this one too, Karl.
Well, you know her.
I know, that's why you have to talk about her.
Well, Emily's work is wonderful because there are so many art historical references I could bring up with her work. Her work is so classy and has such integrity. The way she uses materials and combines painting, found object, and three-dimensional work. I've likened her things to artists like Kurt Schwitter's, his little assemblages, but it has the sort of spiritual intensity of somebody like Joseph Cornell, who did those little box assemblages that were also very mysterious, and also combinations of 2- and 3-dimensional work. And also, I think her work puts Robert Rauschenberg's combined paintings in the shade. I think hers have a lot more class than his stuff. Rauschenberg's stuff usually looks dirty to me. And Emily's work has so many layers, there's so much complexity. It's really, really nice to see. We actually have one of her works in our office now. We don't get to see it these days, but whenever we go back, we will. It's a really nice piece.
So a couple of things we should mention, that most of her work is very large scale. She'll often describe it as they're about her height and about the width of her arms. So she'll say that it's her height and her hug. Also, another example of using a lot of found materials, unusual materials. She has a background in textile art. She studied textile design at UMass Dartmouth, as well as painting. And you can kind of see both of those, as well as kind of an emergent sculptural practice is happening too. Yeah, so if you can get in close on images of her artwork, you can really see a lot of detail and interesting.
And really fascinating objects.
I was just going to say, one of the questions that we have is what are some of the materials that Emily uses in her work?
So let's see. In this piece here, there's actually some tea bags in the eyes. There's a lot of fabric, and
She uses a lot of lace, which I love.
yes, increasingly a large amount of it. Oops. Oh, well, let's look at this one. You can kind of see. One of the things there's a lot of layers. So she works in layers and she builds them up very slowly, and the pieces transform a lot over time. So this is a close-up of one of her pieces. And you can see that there's, let's see, what's in here? Coffee grounds, paint, dirt, gel medium, leaves. She uses like turmeric for a lot of that yellow coloring is turmeric, coffee grounds. I think I said that already. Fabric, lace, a couple of her pieces have a little bit of cement in them, wood, really whatever is available. There's a safety pin right here. But yeah, so I'm married to Emily, and we have studios next to each other in our place. So it's, I get to see a lot of her work in progress, and it's exciting, but that's also why I made Karl talk about it, because I didn't want to seem too much like a negativity. But this is definitely an interesting idea of what you can do with found materials, found fabric, things that you have available at home that maybe aren't being used. There's some felt in different places. There's some lint, there's some seashells in the nose, and lots of layers of different things. A few pieces have birds' nests in them. So Angela Allez is originally from Columbia, and she's also a Massachusetts artist. She is primarily she considers herself a surrealist painter, but also a figurative painter. Her work is has been very technical and precise, but over time it's getting more and more abstract. So an interesting thing that's happening with her work is she's been responding to what's been happening with immigration law and a lot of the controversy about immigration in the United States. And as an immigrant herself, has been trying to make work that's more intentionally about that. But as her work is becoming more intentionally political and more about a concrete subject, the imagery is becoming more abstract. So I think that's really interesting. So, a lot of the immigration is represented by these ladders. You'll see these small ladders in her pieces.
What medium does she use, Rob? Is that oil?
Yeah, it's oil. And I think probably some wax mediums to build up texture, that sort of thing. But she also works in a lot of layers. And but there's a lot of like finely detailed pieces in each one. Karl, you want to talk about her connection?
Yeah, her work has always reminded me, some of it reminds me of Leonora Carrington, who was a British surrealist in the 40s. And she also reflects the figurative focus of Colombian art since like the 1960s. And of course, a lot of surrealists are realists as well, like Magritte. But there are several women artists, like, as I said, Leonora Carrington, who combine fantasy with figurative works of art. And also in some of her figures, like the one on the right here, you see that sort of oval face that you can see in the sculpture of the Muisca culture that was an early Colombian indigenous culture. sort of almond eyes and a sort of a round sculptural face. I think that might be an influence of ancient Colombian art. She's got a lot of wonderful, like a combination of wonderful influences. And then there's also there are allusions to classical art as well, which of course the Colombian art world was pretty academic right up until like the 20th century. And that's a tradition that a lot of artists currently are returning to in Colombia, the progressive artists.
Okay, so I think, whoa, that's the last artist we had prepped for today's presentation. If you have other questions for us, please type them in. We do have
one question.
Okay.
Have we featured any push pin artists or sequin artists in SchoolArts?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Definitely not push pin.
Not primarily. There may be
Yeah.
some artists that might have used a little bit of them, but no, I don't think so.
Does Emily ever use sequins in her works?
Probably on occasion. But yeah, that's, there's some really interesting stuff out there. Like, there's that artist who makes portraits out of nails. Like, let's see. Should we talk about this now, Tony?
Absolutely. If you are using contemporary art with your class now, either remotely or before you went into the world of remote teaching, we invite you to share what you've been doing with your students on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, and tag @Davis Publications. You'll be entered to win a free subscription to SchoolArts magazine for 1 year.
Okay, let's see what else. Karl, what are some of the resources you look to or that you read regularly to find out more about artists?
I really like the website Design Boom, because they feature not only design but also fine art. And it's, to be honest, a lot of the artists that I've come up with when we have our meetings together have come from Design Boom, because some of them are mind-blowing. I mean, just amazing stuff. Design Boom is one of the main ones. Saatchi Art is another one. They feature a lot of really contemporary artists.
Mm-hmm. Lately, I've actually been discovering a lot of artists on Instagram just by searching the feed or using the hashtag contemporary art, grotesque art, things like that. But there are so many artists on Instagram.
Yeah,
so
Pinterest.
Favorite artists are on there.
Pinterest is another good source.
Is that where you go to find the artists that you feature in Looking and Learning? Is there a way in which people can suggest artists for Looking and Learning?
That's a good question. They could send us an email. But yeah, we're always looking for different artists. One of the things we should have mentioned about Emily Santagata is she's an art teacher. She's a full-time art teacher. And she teaches elementary art in Massachusetts. And we have featured artist teachers in the past, and we'll probably do so again. So, we're always looking for new artists, new things that excite us, things that are different. And we're always trying to look for, to see if we have any blind spots. And if we do have blind spots, we want to correct that because, again, we want to include everyone whenever we can. So yes, so just to recap a couple of things, the majority of these artists that we showed today are in Looking and Learning articles that are available on the SchoolArts website right now. So you can go there and check them out. You can send your students there to check them out. We are also doing additional free webinars every week. So the next one that's coming up is for art supervisors on the 28th. On May 5th, we're going to have a talk with the tape artists, Michael Townsend and Leah Smith. They've been doing tape art. Well, Michael has been doing tape art for 30 years, and he's got a lot of collaborative methods and techniques to share for coming up with great ideas. Then we have one on adaptive art with Bette Naughton, who is a author of a new book that's coming out through Davis. And on the 19th, we'll have Fashion Fundamentals. It's also a new resource book we've got coming out with. So two of the authors, Robin van de Zand and Teresa Jobia, will be presenting that one. So any other questions for us?
No, but just to say in the recording that the adaptive art and fashion fundamentals are both now available on at davisart.com. And that was it.
Okay, well, I guess we're done. Carl disappeared again.
Now poor Carl and his internet connection.
Yes, well, the thing I was really afraid about was that we were going to have a thunderstorm, and one of my little dogs is terrified of thunder. So
That's bad. I'm going to stop the recording now, but we can hang out for a little bit longer in case anybody wants to ask questions after the recording is shut down.
Sure.